this self-created assignment the proposal is due next week. Your job is to design some kind of assignment that will increase your skill and your ability or your adaptive fit or confidence or well-being or your directedness toward your life goals or your identity to become upgraded to a greater sense of who you are. The assignment can require physical, mental, emotional, or spiritual efforts and or outcomes. So you will submit a report to me describing what you assigned yourself to do and whether or not you accomplished what you set out to do. So you become your own instructor on this assignment. You decide what it is you want to assign yourself to do, and you will grade yourself. So in coming up with your proposal, I want to see at least two things. I want to see your plan, how you will measure your plan. That means how you will document your accomplishment of your goal. So I need to see documentation. And the second thing is I want to see some kind of an outcome. So the point of this assignment is to do these things, to upgrade yourself, your skills and abilities. So I want to see some evidence, measured evidence. It doesn't have to show that you succeeded, only that you measured yourself to see if there was any kind of change in your abilities or your confidence or whatever it is that was the goal of this assignment. Does that make sense? Do you have any questions about that?
How long should the assignment be?
The assignment should be about 1 page or less or more.
Okay. And would it be better if we included pictures perhaps, or is it supposed to be just words?
Mostly words, but pictures are very appropriate for some projects. It really depends on the student's project.
Okay.
So diagrams, schedules, and don't try to keep it only to 1 page. If you need to go to 2 or 3 pages, that's fine.
Okay.
There's no space limit. So you will send this to me next week. Hopefully Blackboard will be available and I will receive it on there. Any other questions?
อาจารย์ค่ะ
I don't hear any other questions.
Someone is trying to ask.
Can you
Maybe you can type it and then we can say it for you, because I don't think we
Yeah.
can hear your mic.
Right, good idea. Put it in the chat.
Do you mind repeat it all again? Because like some of us just got into the Zoom and we didn't listen in the beginning.
I understand. I will go over this again at the end of class. But here is the assignment description right here. And the basics are 2 things. Document how you will measure your progress along through the semester, and document how you, any kind of evidence that your assignment accomplished your ultimate goal, which was something about upgrading your abilities or your confidence or your identity. Thank you. All right, I'm going to go on to the next slide. Okay, the science of psychology, data, methods, and strategies. This lecture is to teach you that psychology is a science and it's not only an art. So it should be considered a science. Psychology comes from the root word psyche, which means soul, and logi, which is study. So it is the study of the soul. How do we study something as ephemeral and immaterial as the soul? Should be our next question. A little history. The Greek philosophers argued about what the mind is. And because it's a philosophy, they didn't try to document or prove what it is, but they tried to use logic and rational thinking to decide what mind is. And they came up with lots of interesting ideas, some of which are still considered and subscribed to today. Or actually, the debates continue to today. Number two, early psychology labs attempted to use introspection, but they found that it was difficult to make introspection a scientific method because scientific methods must be objective, and introspection is not very open to documenting by others, so it kind of sort of fails the rule of objectivity. But I think that introspection is coming back as a method. And number three, modern psychology researchers measure behavior, whether conscious or unconscious, such as eating as a conscious behavior, or electrodermal responses from the skin, or EEG, electroencephalography of the brain's activity, also an unconscious process. So we are definitely measuring both conscious and unconscious processes or behaviors, or actions, if you want to call it that. The goals of psychology are defined as the study, psychology is defined as the study of behavior. So that is a goal, is we want to study behavior. And like other studies, other sciences, we attempt to explain, predict, and modify. So we always are referring to behavior in psychology. So what it is that we plan to explain, predict, and modify is always behavior. Human behavior usually, sometimes animal behavior. It's interesting that we humans who have developed this science of psychology, which is all about the human psyche, now we are interested in animal psyches as well, as our field expands. Therefore, it is important that data are objective, reliable, and valid, as is true of any science. These are the types of research data that are collected. There are two basic types, qualitative and quantitative. The methods and results of qualitative studies are in the form of verbal descriptions. So basically, whenever you see qualitative, you can think verbal. Now, qualitative could also be pictorial with photographic evidence, or diagrams, or anything visual. We are not yet at a technological level to offer qualitative evidence to the general public or to scientists in other modalities, but someday perhaps we can convey our results not just in verbal and visual domains, but also auditory. Well, we already got there with TED Talks and yeah. All right, so the other type of data collected is quantitative, where our methods and results are in the form of numerical descriptions. So for example, young drivers commit 1.3 times more risky maneuvers than other drivers is a quantitative result. And we get that from a quantitative method. Quantitative just means numerical. It's a more popular method of research because it can be analyzed with statistics. Statistics are very much in vogue in psychology, whereas qualitative methods are seeming to lag behind in terms of popularity among scientists because we sort of trust numbers and math as more objective and more foolproof and less open to interpretation. However, qualitative methods reach farther beyond what we can measure quantitatively. So qualitative research will always have an important place in science and in psychology especially. Introspective studies. This is one, okay, so now I'm going over individual kinds of methods that are used in psychology. Are there any questions before I go on? Okay. I'm seeing there's a chat box, but I can't read it. Introspection studies. This is one of the earliest methods, as I mentioned before. It fell into disrepute due to lack of objectivity. An example is when a patient reports physical problems and pain, which patients can do better than doctors can do. We might be able to detect pain through brain activity, but we cannot really determine where the pain is, how severe it is, what kind of pain it is. So we really still depend on self-report, introspective measures for a lot of things. And you'll see this whenever you go to the doctor and the doctor asks you, on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is your pain? The advantage is that it is excellent for obtaining subjective experience. But the disadvantage is that it is not objective, and it's not very reliable. Case studies are another method. It's an early method. It's not very popular, but it continues to be useful to today. And it is very effective for certain kinds of scientific questions. Oh, I remember last time I was able to generate captions. Hold on, I'm reading the chat box. I see. Okay, someone asked me, can I use my headphones? I did bring them. However, I have found that my voice is less clear and less loud through my headphone microphone, even when I hold it up by my mouth. For some reason, the headphones microphone is not as good as my computer microphone. Maybe I should invest in a standalone microphone. I might do that to improve your ability to hear me. Sorry about that. Last time I got Google to auto caption for me. I don't yet know how to do that today. Sorry.
Sir, I think you have to like first click present first, and then on the bottom left corner, it will like give you some options on what to do.
Oh, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, great. One moment. Get rid of this little. Thank you. Yes, that's it. Wonderful. Thank you so much. Is it Bambi? Is that what you? Great. All right. All right. So the advantage of case studies is that it allows you to tell a story, which can be memorable and informative for those who read your report. Stories are unique in that they grasp attention better than anything else, and they are remembered better than most other things. So this is a clear advantage for case studies. A disadvantage is that you don't know if others would behave in the same way as in the way that you documented in your case study. So you don't know how well your results generalize to the population of other people that you could have studied. An example of a case study is Sigmund Freud's study of Anna O. And I have here some information about that. Anna O suffered from hysteria, in which patients exhibit physical symptoms without a physical cause. Her doctor treated Anna by helping her to recall forgotten memories of traumatic events. She developed a fear of drinking when a dog she hated drank from her glass, and she had some psychological difficulties with her father. She was unconscious of anxiety, but during psychoanalysis, she said she was anxious and identified some unconscious thoughts. When she did this, her paralysis disappeared. Freud heard about her symptoms and often the surface manifestation of deeply repressed conflicts. So he proposed his ideas in The Studies of Hysteria in 1895, and his thinking helped to shape the future of psychology. So this is an example of a case study that was used by one of our earliest, most popular and most influential psychologists, Sigmund Freud. So more advantages of case studies are that you can collect a lot of information about the participant, so you can get a full picture of the person that you're getting data from. This is rare, and this is not possible in larger sample studies, where you cannot really get a full picture of each participant. You cannot understand how their individual biographical details and how their your observations of them influence their behavior, or their journals, letters, and photographs. These things, which form part of their own biographical perspective, they're part of their own experience, cannot be considered and explored as having possible causes on their behavior, influences. So case studies have high ecological validity. and they're good for developing hunches. You might wonder what ecological validity is. That means that it is valid, that your findings are valid in the real world, not only in a laboratory. This is something we always need to worry about or concern ourselves with when we study psychology in a laboratory. How much ecological validity is there? Okay, here's an example of a case study that was published relatively recently, about 5 years ago.
Excuse me, Mr. Johnson.
Yes,
Some classmates needs to be accepted in the class.
thank you so much. Just admitted them. Thanks for that reminder. I do appreciate that. Please remind me. Okay. Yeah, so this is a recent case study that was published in a decent journal, just to show you that it happens. Naturalistic studies. Observation studies. Observing behavior as it unfolds in the natural environment. An example is Jane Goodall, who you might know as the woman who studied chimpanzees for most of her life. Here's a little image in the top right corner. She was able to study and learn so much about chimpanzees' personality, which maybe we would not even think about them as having personalities, but we learn now that they have complex societies and their behavior is very interesting, surprising, and intelligent and structured, organized. And that's thanks to her observing their behavior in their natural environment, not in a laboratory. You can't really get a full picture, a real understanding of the intricacy of their societal organization except by studying them in their natural habitat. So it is with humans as well, probably. We need to study them in their own natural habitats to get a more sure grasp of how they would really behave. So it's good for ecological validity. The advantage is that you can see behavior in its natural environments, not influenced by unnatural variables and conditions, and it's good for developing hunches. Disadvantages that it can be unclear why people or apes behave as they do, or any animals, wolves, ants, anything. Experimental studies. This is the gold standard for science. There is no such thing as a perfect method for studying science, but the experimental study comes closest to the perfect method because it has great strengths and the drawbacks are limited. It's very convincing to other researchers as well. So the advantage is that it's well controlled. Extraneous variables are controlled as much as possible, as much as you can think about controlling them, and design your study to do so. And causality can be deduced. That's the important one, causality. Because in some other studies, in other methods, we cannot be sure of causality. We don't know if A causes B or B causes A, but in in experimental studies, we can. We can conclude it's A causing B and not the other way around. Or at least A can cause B, and it may also be the other way around as well. The disadvantage is the limitation that experimental the experimental environment may not look like the real world environment. So we might not be able to reproduce findings outside of the lab. And there's a little diagram illustrating results of an experimental study with a control group. Well, it doesn't say whether there's a control group. Actually, yeah, all of the conditions are being compared against one another in this diagram. I will show you, I will explain more about that study. So this is an example. A student researcher stands on the corner with a stop sign. Oh, I see. This is actually for the previous slide. So let me back up. An example of a naturalistic study. A student researcher stands on the corner with a stop sign and holding a pad of paper. The student notes whether passing drivers completely stop at the stop sign. The second phase of the observation takes place on the same corner, but this time the student is hidden. Equal time is given to both sections of the study. In general, people will make sure to come to a complete stop when they know that they're being observed. That was the student's results. And this illustrates the shortcoming of well, actually, it is an experimental study because there are two conditions and they're being compared to each other. And it also illustrates the shortcoming of the laboratory. When participants know that they are being watched, they may change their behavior. Whereas in the previous version, the naturalistic study, participants may not know that they're being watched, and this then allows, so they behave more naturally. So we can see there's no real perfect method. When we compare the two, we can see that behavior changes. And now I'm going to, okay, I'll go on to the next slide. So for experimental studies, you ask your research question, which is also, can be called your hypothesis. So for example, it's whether it's a hypothesis or a question just depends on how you phrase it. Coffee makes people recall more words from a studied random word list. That is a hypothesis. It could be framed as a question, as do people recall more words with coffee? And I crossed out the words learn better because learn better is too nondescript. It's too vague. When you want to address a research question or hypothesis, you have to define all of the terms as clearly as possible. So instead of learn better, replace that with recall more words, because learn better is hard to measure until you define how you're going to measure it. So the ideal hypothesis is very well defined in terms of how you're going to measure your variables and your outcomes. In this case, the independent variable is caffeine, and it can be measured in the conditions. So your conditions could be 0, 100, and 500 milligrams. These measurements are conditions. They are the independent variable. The dependent variable is the words recalled after 1 minute of study. and 5 minutes of delay. Or it's however much delay or however much study that I decide. The dependent variable is the outcome. The dependent variable gives you your answer. The independent variable is your method for testing the question. The independent variable is assigned before the study begins. It is decided in advance, and it is independent of the outcome, or it is, well, I'll back up on that statement. The dependent variable, it's dependent on your conditions and on how participants behave. I'm going to give you an example. I'm going to read an example to you. Psychologist Elizabeth Loftus wondered how information given after an event can affect eyewitness testimony. Her hypothesis was that leading questions could distort and alter eyewitness testimony accounts, causing a confabulating, which means lying, effect by cues provided to the questioner, by the questioner. The test was whether people asked to estimate the speed of motor vehicles using different forms of questions would answer in different ways. Estimating vehicle speed is something people are generally poor at doing, and so they may be more open to suggestion. So they viewed 7 different films in 7 different groups of people. Each group watched one kind of film of a traffic accident ranging in duration from 5 to 30 seconds. And were presented in a random order to 7 groups of participants. After watching the film, participants were asked to describe what happened as if they were the eyewitness testimony giver. They were asked specific questions, including the question, how fast were the cars going when they, and then this was the experimental variable, when they smashed into each other, or when they collided into each other, or when they bumped, or hit, or contacted each other. So by asking the question in a different way with a different descriptor, each participant was given that little bit of a leading question. The leading question is the description of that collision, because hit or contacted does not sound as fast as of a car crash as smashed. Thus the manipulation was the wording of the question. That's the independent variable. And the measure, which is the dependent variable, was the speed reported by participants. So the participants estimated the speed at, say, about 30 miles an hour, 60 miles an hour, or 60 kilometers per hour. The findings were that the estimated speed was affected by the verb that was used, which implied information about the speed, and systematically affected participants' memory of the accident. So those in the smashed condition reported higher speeds than the collided condition and the bumped condition and the hit and the contacted conditions. Contacted only was estimated at 32 miles an hour, whereas smashed was estimated at 41 miles an hour. This suggests that eyewitness testimony might be biased by the way that the question is asked after a crime is committed. And memory for the event is influenced and is highly flexible based on new information given during the interval between witnessing the event and recalling the event. Discover. The leading question can modify memory. All right, so that was a long reading example of experimental study, but it illustrates the independent variable and dependent variable. Usually there's an experimental group and a control group. An example is group A receives toothpaste with fluoride in it, and group B receives toothpaste with no fluoride in it. Then we can measure tooth decay in the two groups after 1 year. What then is the independent variable? Anyone?
Just decay.
No.
Okay.
Fluoride.
Oh, fluoride, sorry.
Yes,
That's dependent.
that's right. I was going to ask what's the dependent variable, and you answered it. Decay. Great. The placebo effect is when participants who think they receive a treatment experience the benefit of the treatment. So if someone thinks that they're getting fluoride in their toothpaste, they might receive the fluoride-free toothpaste, but still get fewer cavities than they would have because they think that they're getting fluoride toothpaste. Now you might be shocked and surprised, how can thinking that you're getting fluoride do the same effect as getting fluoride, reducing your cavities? This is the neat and amazing thing about the placebo effect, that its effect is so mysterious. It is a topic that is very interesting to me, and I think it's very important and worth a lot of study. I went to school with a guy who was studying the placebo effect. However, it's so hard to study this effect, he had to change his dissertation to another topic. It's just a very hard thing to study. But maybe your generation will be the ones to tackle and master and give a great explanation for the placebo effect. To separate the placebo effect from the experimental method or the experimental effect, scientists use a double-blind experiment method. That's when the experimenter does not know who the participants, which participants are assigned to which condition, and the participants also don't know which conditions they are assigned to. Now this double blind, meaning that no one knows which conditions anyone is in, means that the participants cannot read the scientist's eyes and try to guess whether they're in the experiment group or the control group. So if nobody knows what condition they're in, it helps to reduce or eliminate the placebo effect. I would say reduce. I don't think you can ever remove completely the placebo effect. This diagram illustrates, with another example, the experimental study method. So a random sample of participants from a population is sampled. So this sampling is just part of the process, all right? And then you divide the sample into a random, you randomly assign them into a control group and an experimental group. Your independent variable in this study, which is rabbit-assisted therapy for orphan children, and this was done in an orphanage in Thailand. So this, the independent variable is which group the girls were assigned to. And the dependent variable, there can be multiple dependent variables. So in this one, there were 3 dependent variables: self-esteem, depression, and happiness. Field experiments, that's the next method that I want to talk about here. An example is Hulfing's hospital study on obedience. I will read to you about that study. Hulfing did a naturalistic field experiment involving 22 night nurses. He had a fake doctor known as Dr. Smith, might have been himself, I don't know, call the nurses at the hospital on 22 separate occasions and asked them to check to see if they had the drug aspartame. When the nurses checked, they could see that the maximum dosage was supposed to be 10 milligrams. When they reported to the doctor that they had found aspartame, the doctor indicated to give 20 milligrams, so double the maximum dose, to a patient who was also a staged patient known as Mr. Jones. So Dr. Smith was in a desperate hurry, and he said over the phone, he said he would sign the authorization form when he came to see Mr. Jones later on. The medication was not real, though the nurses thought that it was. If the nurses administered the drugs, they would have broken 3 hospital rules. They were not allowed to accept instructions over the phone. The dose was double the maximum limit on the box, and the medicine itself was unauthorized because it was not on the ward stock list. The drug itself was a harmless sugar pill. 21 out of 22 nurses complied with the instruction. When other nurses were asked if they would have done the same thing, 21 out of 22 other nurses, that's a control group, said that they would not comply with that order if it were given to them. Hulfing demonstrated that people are very unwilling to comply with authority. Sorry, they're very willing to comply with authority, but they don't think that they are. So people don't think that they're willing, but they are very willing when it comes to the real world and their real jobs. This is an example of a field experiment. It is using the experimental method. There's a experimental group and there's a control group. But it is done in the field. That means in the natural environment, just like a naturalistic study. The advantages, there's less demand characteristics. Demand characteristic means the participants feel the demand from the experimenter to behave in a certain expected way. Now, in this case, they did feel like they were expected to behave some way, but this was because this was the very thing that was being studied, is how they would behave in their natural environment. In other words, demand characteristic is susceptibility to trying to be a good participant in a study, trying to act as the experimenter expects you to act. So the demand comes from the experimenter, but is expressed in the participants. The environment is more real. There's greater external validity when you study participants in the field. The disadvantage is that there's less control and more extraneous factors to explain why participants behaved that way. You don't know if it's because of the other doctors and how they affect the nurses in this hospital, or you don't know if it's because of just that particular group of nurses or the nursing culture in that hospital. There's other variables that could explain the results. These troubling variables are called extraneous factors, extraneous variables. Extraneous means outside of the study, not what you are studying, not what you are manipulating, and not what you are hoping to affect your results. You're hoping that extraneous variables don't affect your results too much. The next method is the correlational method. Correlation studies are non-experimental studies that investigate how one variable is related to another variable. So variables can be related either positively, negatively, or not at all. It's a statistical technique to find a correlation coefficient, which is a index or measure ranging from -1 to +1 that describes in that number the relationship between two variables. Examples are positive, negative, and no correlation. Positive, like the relationship between height and weight. The -1 is elevation and temperature. The higher you go up, the lower the temperature. And no correlation between tea ingested and level of intelligence. Maybe level of alertness is positively correlated with tea ingested or coffee, caffeine, but not intelligence. Intelligence is I'm thinking of intelligence as the more stable trait, not the trait measured in the happenstance moment. Correlation is not causation. The third variable problem is that two measured variables may both be affected by a third unmeasured variable that you did not even consider. An example is the correlation between viewing violent TV programs and violence at school. We can see from many studies that have been done over decades that the more violent TV viewing that children watch, the more violent they behave in school. But we don't know if there's a causal link between those. So the third variable problem reminds us that we cannot draw a causal conclusion from correlation evidence. The naive view is that violent TV causes school violence. This is naive because it completely ignores, it's naive about the third variable problem. A smarter view is that school violence might encourage violent TV viewing. That means the reverse causal direction, or that both behaviors might be caused by deeper, unseen factors, such as violent parents. Any questions or comments or complaints at this point? All right, I'll go on.
Oh, wait, sorry.
Yes.
What's the difference between ecological validity and external validity? Because it seems like they're really similar.
Oh, great point. I hadn't considered how similar those two things are. External validity is continuing to be valid outside of the experiment itself. Ecological validity is whether your results are valid in the real world. So they are almost the same. Good point. I had not even connected those before. They are pretty much the same thing. Thank you.
Thank you, sir.
Can you please explain what external validity is again, please?
Sure. External validity is when your results can be trusted by other researchers. I think that's a good explanation. It's when your results generalize beyond your study. If your results are true and valid for your study, but only for your study, then that's limited, that is of limited use to others. So to the extent that your results are valuable and extend beyond your study, that is, that they extend externally. So external to your study. That's what it is. Interview studies. By the way, thank you for that question. I have not ever made it as clear in my own mind until I was now asked. And that, yeah, that's it. It's external to your study.
Excuse me, teacher. My friend is waiting to be accepted into the Zoom call.
Thank you.
Sorry. Thank you.
Interview studies can be structured or unstructured or focus groups. Structured ones are like job interviews, and there's less closeness between the interviewer and the participants. Consistent wording is used throughout each interview because the data are being gathered in a systematic and controlled way where you're controlling, you have to control how you ask the question in order to average the results across participants. So structured interviews assume quantitative analysis, whereas unstructured interviews are more like getting to know someone. They can be loose and flexible, and the participant can direct the conversation. It's a good type of interview for qualitative studies, where you're not so interested in the exact proportion of participants that answer this way or the number that answers this way. You're more interested in gaining insight into people's thinking process or their perspectives or their feelings, things that cannot be described with numbers, but can be described very well with words and descriptions. In fact, qualitative is almost synonymous with descriptive and adjectives. So if you read a qualitative study, you should expect to see adjectives. Focus group, that's when it can be structured or unstructured, but you interview a group, not an individual. Usually the group has somewhere between 6 to 12 participants, and responses are realistic, and participants maybe talk together and think together and respond to one another's comments. So this is good for groups thinking together, and that's pretty good because in the natural world, we do think together and talk together, and we are influenced by one another's views. However, this is also susceptible to peer influence. We don't know if we're getting the answers that people really think and feel, or if they're saying what they perceive to be acceptable to the group. Questionnaire studies are like interviews, but are on paper or on electronic forms, or can be done over the phone. The advantage is that it's quick and efficient to collect data from a large sample, and it's very good for quantitative studies. That's why questionnaires are a very popular method among social scientists who need to collect. Because psychology has a tradition of collecting data from a large numbers of people, psychology is still very strongly having a preference for numerical descriptions rather than verbal descriptions of people and thinking and behavior. So because of our current zeitgeist or culture or value of numbers over adjectives, we find that questionnaire studies are very popular nowadays, and have been for decades, and probably will be for decades to come. The disadvantage of the questionnaire method is that the particular words used can change the results. Just as we saw in the case of Loftus's study with the word smashed, collided, other hit, contacted. So the word that you use in your questionnaire can change the results. So when you report your results, you should also always report how you asked the question, because that affects the results. Participants may rush, or they might not be representative of the population. These are some possible disadvantages of the questionnaire method. The items and questions that you use can be open-ended or closed-ended. Open-ended is better for qualitative research because it's hard to accumulate a bunch of open-ended answers into a quantitative way, so it's usually for qualitative. For example, Kohlberg's moral dilemma research used open-ended questions. Closed questions are for qualitative and quantitative analyses, but are very quantitative analyses pretty much require closed-ended questions for describing not an individual's response, but a group of people's response to a question, to each question. The next type of study is observation studies. These can be overt observation, which means people can see that you're watching them, or they can be covert. Covert, if you can look at the word cover in that word, it is secretive watching, like behind a one-way mirror. These studies are when the researcher, so in a participant observation study, that's a kind of observation study. The researcher joins the group to get closer, more detailed observations. So if the researcher joins the group and participates with the group, that is, well, actually, If they join the group just to observe, that's a participant observation. If they join the group and they actually interact with the members of the group, that's a naturalistic observation study. Because it's more natural if you're not just there sitting and watching them and documenting, but you're also freely interacting and behaving with them to make them feel that it is completely natural and that they are not being studied. So naturalistic is very covert. And the controlled study is usually a structured participant assigned to groups, behavior coded rather than described, illustrated on the next slide. This slide shows a checklist that the researcher can use. They could be marking checks on their grid, coding for participants' behavior, either sitting among them or standing behind a one-way mirror, or after interacting with them for a while, when they can go back and be by themselves alone, then they can take notes. But usually a checklist like this is for making observations on the fly. That means in the moment. Any questions?
I have a question about the covert and overt. What's the difference exactly?
Overt means obvious. And covert means secretive. Thank you. Any other questions? Okay. Now I go on to ethical issues. Can I go back to interview studies? So if you can imagine a candy bar company releases a new version of their candy bar, they want to know how it is received. A focus group of 10 participants can be given the candy bar and try it, and then interviewed using questions such as how much they like it, how willing they are to pay for it, how much money they would pay to pay for it, and whether they would plan to buy it in the future. That's an example of a focus group. And an example of open-ended questions is, what sleep issues have you faced during university? And an example of a closed question, I'll give you several examples. Questions such as, how much sleep did you get last night? Because that's answered in a number of hours. So you cannot answer with a whole sentence. You have to answer with a number. So that's a closed question. How much did you sleep? Do you usually sleep on school nights? Is another closed question. Do you feel that you get adequate sleep? Yes or no? Or you could have 1 equals yes, 7 equals no, 4 equals somewhat, and you could have a 1 to 7 answer. That's also a closed question. Does sleep deprivation limit your effectiveness when learning in class? Maybe that can be a yes or no question. So those are examples. And I also want to give an example of a controlled observation. Mary Ainsworth used a controlled observation study to study child attachment. Actually, there's not much illustration there. Okay, let me go on. All right, ethical issues. Does the study cause discomfort for participants? Does it involve deception? Do participants have a right to withdraw? Confidentiality, is it protected? Is informed consent obtained? These are ethical issues that have to be addressed for every experiment before you run your study. It doesn't matter if you're using, it doesn't matter what kind of experiment, study method you're using. It could be correlation study, questionnaire method, observation study, anything. You always have to answer these ethical questions and issues. Usually you need to gain permission, ethical approval to run any study before you run it. And who do you ask permission to run a study? You ask the institution that hires you to do the research. For example, I do research and I am employed by Chulalongkorn University. So I have to ask Chula for ethical approval before I can do any research of my own. For your own research, you will, later on in this class, I will ask you to do some research. And your ethical approval will have to go through me. So I will be your institution and grant you ethical approval or not for doing research within our class. Any questions here?
Can I ask you questions about like the participant and naturalistic? So they are like qualitative studies
The participant, let me see,
and naturalistic.
naturalistic. No, they can be qualitative or quantitative.
So what's the difference? Like I understand participant like different from the naturalistic, but I know like both like the above two are like any different from the controlled.
These are ways that you can study participants, but what makes it qualitative or quantitative is the kind of data that you collect. If you collect data and you are counting the number of participants that act in a certain way, then that counting makes it quantitative. However, if you are simply describing your participants' behavior using adjectives or phrases or sentences, and you have no intention to add or subtract or average responses, then you are using a qualitative method, because your method, your data is qualitative if it is adjectives, descriptions, like that.
But I mean like about the controlled. So the controlled one is like different from the other two because the behavior is coded rather than described.
The controlled, what makes it different from the other two,
Yep.
is that you can control the environment. So you can test in a controlled environment, you usually test one participant at a time. It's still an observation study because you are still observing how they behave in their controlled environment. It can be one at a time or maybe a few at a time. Like if you had groups of 3 and you tested one group of 3 and then another group of 3 and then another group of 3, always in the same controlled environment with the same toys or the same educational materials, that would be controlled.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Good question. Next, beware of poor studies. Be hypervigilant about studies that reference hot topics, because any little clues that can be taken as evidence supporting one side of a contentious issue will be broadcast to sway public opinion. Beware of studies that incite moral panic or with fabulous claims. The misinformation effect can create global-scale negative consequences and undermine public confidence in the news. This is the concept behind fake news. The idea of fake news, which was not even a really prevalent concept like even 3 years ago, it was considered so unlikely and implausible, or maybe so ignored by so many people that nobody ever thought about fake news. But now misinformation is becoming more and more acknowledged, at least in my own perspective, that we do have to worry about things like fake news. So we get the misinformation effect whenever bad, poor studies, poorly controlled, poorly conducted, but with fabulous results, or results that create a panic. Those results may leak into the news and then go to the general public, which can create a misinformation effect. Even when such studies are retracted and every news story is corrected, yet many people will not be updated by that, so by the correction. So research shows that once people accept an idea, they become less motivated to challenge or change it. We need to be aware of this. That's why we should be on our guard against accepting fabulous or outrageous claims without doing our own bit of investigating and looking into how well was the study conducted, what were the problems with the study, what are some alternate interpretations. Also, beware of pseudoscience. So pseudoscience is obviously bad science. Poorly conducted, poorly. It may not even be an attempt at learning or gaining new knowledge. You can see quizzes on the internet that people like to take, and it's just a way of getting internet traffic by creating a quiz that supposedly can tell you things about yourself. But you need to be aware that of the validity of these quizzes, because often they are not based on anything at all. They're completely invalid. So to help us understand how invalid these personality quizzes are, we can do a little activity in which we can make our own quiz. So, for example, you could say, someone whose favorite ice cream is chocolate is a go-getter, that they are a bold business partner and that they will excel in business. It might sound convincing because all of the descriptors go together and match, but it's just based on creative, imaginative writing, and it does not make it true. It also doesn't make it false. Just because you can describe something, the meaning of something doesn't make it true or false. So train your mind to withhold judgment for or against baseless claims until you know better. Now I'd like to do this little activity, so I'd like to have you get in groups. I will assign you to groups. Just come up with 5 ice cream flavors and make up 5 descriptions of someone who would select that ice cream and offer some lifestyle advice for them, what their preferred ice cream means. All right, so I'm going to try to group you. figure out how to do it. Huh. Okay, well, give me, let's have a 5-minute break because I need to figure out how to, it was easy last week, but I can't seem to figure out how to create the breakout groups.